June 1944. The Pacific sky trembled with heat and distance. American carrier pilots were returning from a deep strike. Engines coughing, fuel gauges pinned near zero. Japanese observers watched from afar, convinced the aircraft would fall into the sea before reaching their decks. But one by one, the American planes touched down, exhausted, precise, unbroken. It defied everything Japan believed about range, endurance, and survival. Subscribe now to witness the full untold story. The Pacific was not merely a battlefield. It was an oceanic empire of distance, silence, and uncertainty. Thousands of miles of open water separated targets, fleets, and fuel. In this vast expanse, the side that mastered endurance and navigation would control the war. Early in World War II, Japan believed it held that advantage. The Imperial Japanese Navy had trained long-range strike units, refined naval air tactics, and built carriers designed to project power deep into enemy waters. Their pilots were proud, elite, and disciplined. They believed that only Japan truly understood the art of naval air warfare. Yet, as the conflict unfolded, the Pacific proved unforgiving. Aircraft did not just need speed or firepower, they needed fuel. Every operation demanded precise calculations: distance to target, return routes, emergency alternatives, wind direction, fuel burn under combat load, and the unknown factor of survival itself. For many pilots, their flight instruments were not just tools, they were lifelines. In the early war years, Japanese forces struck with astonishing range. Pearl Harbor demonstrated the reach of Japanese carrier aviation. Their attackers flew farther than many believed feasible. Japan had trained pilots to operate on tight fuel margins, to push engines to maximum efficiency, to trust that precision and timing could compensate for risk. But this confidence contained a flaw. Japan believed no enemy could replicate such daring. They believed American pilots lacked the discipline, the training, the experience, and the courage to fly at the edge of fuel starvation and still return home alive. That belief would cost them dearly. Across the ocean, the United States Navy had been building something extraordinary: a system of unrelenting training, backed by industrial support and meticulous strategy. While Japanese aviation relied heavily on elite, irreplaceable veterans, U.S. naval aviation slowly became a machine. Pilots trained together, rotated through systematic programs, instructed to manage fuel under stress, and conditioned to survive long flights with precision calm. And there was another key difference: American carriers were floating cities of efficiency. On U.S. decks, aircraft were launched, refueled, rearmed, and recovered with mechanical discipline. Every movement on deck and below had been rehearsed thousands of times. Every crewman knew his place in the sequence. The U.S. did not simply fly long missions, they made it possible to recover aircraft even when the margin of fuel was so thin it came down to the final minute in the air. Meanwhile, Japanese naval aviation culture treated fuel differently. They planned missions with built-in safety margins or expected crews to ditch at sea if necessary. They admired boldness, but they did not invest in large-scale airborne navigation training or advanced rescue operations. Japan had fewer search and rescue units, fewer long-range float planes assigned to retrieval duty, and fewer destroyers trained to retrieve downed airmen. A pilot who ran out of fuel was often simply lost to the sea. The United States took a different approach. Every American pilot understood that if they lived, they could fly again tomorrow. The U.S. invested in saving lives because the war ahead would demand long-term endurance. This crucial difference, how each nation valued the pilot, shaped the fate of the Pacific skies. So 1943 and 1944 unfolded. The tide shifted. U.S. forces began launching long-range strike missions deep into Japanese defensive zones. missions that Japanese commanders believed were impossible to return from. They watched through binoculars, through scattering cloud breaks, through flashes of anti-air bursts, expecting to see American aircraft fall into the ocean before reaching their carriers. But the aircraft kept returning. Some glided in on fumes. Some touched down with tanks nearly dry. Some pilots landed so low on fuel they could not taxi and had to be dragged clear of the deck. Japan was stunned, not because the Americans survived, but because they planned to. This was not luck. It was doctrine. It was discipline. It was the start of an aviation shift that would change the balance of the war. And to understand how America made this possible, we must turn to the foundation that made their endurance real: U.S. naval aviation training and doctrine. American naval aviation was not built on daring alone. It was built on systems, structures, repetition that honed instinct into precision. While many nations valued bold pilots, the United States valued repeatable excellence, the kind that could be taught, standardized, and scaled across thousands of airmen. This is what made the difference when fuel ran low and survival came down to the final mile of open ocean. Before ever touching a carrier deck, U.S. aviators spent months, sometimes years, learning to manage variables that could kill them. They trained to read the weather on the horizon, to account for shifting winds, to plot position without visual landmarks, to calculate fuel burn while under fire, and to land on a deck that was barely more than a wandering steel island in a moving sea. This was not romantic flying. It was mathematical flying. Every American pilot learned that the ocean was wide, unforgiving, and indifferent. Their survival depended not on bravery alone, but on planning that bordered on obsession. They memorized consumption charts, studied altitudes for best range, and learned engine management the way some learn instinctive gestures. To the untrained observer, this looked effortless. But behind every miraculous return was 1,000 quiet decisions being made. Every minute in the cockpit, Japan underestimated this. The Imperial Japanese Navy assumed that because American society produced fewer natural warriors, fewer men raised in martial traditions, fewer pilots forged in pre-war elite corps, the U.S. could not produce aviators capable of disciplined endurance flying. They expected American pilots to panic when fuel ran low, to abandon missions early, to break formation, to ditch in the sea rather than trust numbers and training. But American naval aviators did not break. Part of the reason was the structure surrounding them. U.S. training was layered. Pilots trained not just to fly, but to fly efficiently. Instructors drilled them on conserving fuel without sacrificing speed when it mattered. They learned when to climb to cooler altitudes to stretch range, and when to descend to escape headwinds. They practiced throttle control with the same seriousness others reserved for gunnery. And then there were the checklists. American carrier aviation depended on standardization. Every pilot prepared for missions using detailed briefing notes, expected distances, contingency waypoints, bingo fuel limits, the minimum fuel necessary to return home, and emergency rescue procedures. This clarity reduced uncertainty. It meant that when combat chaos struck, as it always did, American pilots did not guess. They executed. Meanwhile, deck operations on American carriers were designed to support this doctrine. When aircraft returned low on fuel, the U.S. Navy could recover planes faster than any other force in the world. Deck crews cleared landing space in seconds. Barriers lifted. Rescue crews stood ready. Some pilots landed with barely enough fuel to keep the propeller spinning, but the ship was prepared because the entire crew had rehearsed this scenario hundreds of times. This system gave pilots confidence that if they could just reach the ship, even with tanks nearly empty, they would. Live Japan noticed this, and they did not know how to match it. The Imperial Japanese Navy had world-class pilots early in the war, but they lacked a sustainable training pipeline. Their veterans were irreplaceable, and every pilot lost was a blow that could not be recovered. Their training emphasized aggressive combat and individual excellence, but it did not prioritize fuel efficiency, navigation proficiency, or systematic return coordination. U.S. aviators, on the other hand, were replaceable by design, not because they were lesser, but because the system was strong enough to train thousands of them to the same high standard. This ensured consistency, predictability, and endurance across the fleet. Japan fought with heroes. America fought with doctrine. And doctrine endures where heroism alone fades. By 1944, American pilots were flying missions farther than Japanese officers believed physically possible. They crossed open water for hours, struck hardened targets, and returned to their carriers with fuel gauges nearly empty, yet fully in control. Japanese pilots could not understand it. They believed these returns defied mechanical limits. They did not. They demonstrated what American aviation had become: calculated, disciplined, relentless. This mastery set the stage for the moment when Japanese disbelief would turn into shock, not in theory, but in battle. To see that moment clearly, we must look at Japan's own assumptions and how they shattered. For years before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it understood the limits of carrier-based aviation better than any nation on Earth. Their carrier pilots had trained to operate across long distances, to push deep into enemy territory, and to return with enough fuel to fight again. Their early victories fed this confidence. Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, the attack on the Philippines. These successes convinced Japanese commanders that range was their domain, a tactical territory that Japan alone could truly exploit. But confidence carries shadows, and assumptions, when unchecked, become weaknesses. Japan measured the endurance of aircraft not only by fuel capacity, but by pilot philosophy. Their pilots were taught that if fuel ran low, the mission was either finished, or the pilot was expected to ditch in the sea, surrender their machine to the waves, and accept fate without fear. To run out of fuel was not shameful. It was simply the cost of extreme commitment. The individual pilot was expected to be ready to die if the mission required it. What Japan did not prepare for was an enemy that refused to frame endurance in fatal terms. The U.S. Navy believed that every pilot mattered. Every aircraft recovered meant another mission flown tomorrow. Every crew saved represented future strength. Over time, this meant something crucial. American pilots flew to survive. Japanese pilots flew willing to be sacrificed. This difference shaped how each side calculated fuel. Japanese aviators were trained around clear strike and return equations. A mission was either within safe return range, or it wasn't. When distances stretched too far, commanders often accepted that some pilots would simply not return. This mindset made Japan believe that flying to the very edge of fuel endurance was reckless unless immediate strategic victory demanded it. To Japanese eyes, then, what the Americans began doing in late 1943 and into 1944 appeared impossible, even irrational. U.S. aircraft began conducting deep strikes, flights so long that Japanese officers believed no pilot could return safely. Yet the American planes did return, and that return created disbelief. Observers aboard Japanese carriers, destroyers, and island outposts recorded the same scene again and again. American dive bombers and torpedo planes coming back from missions that should have pushed them past fuel limits. Engines sputtering, gauges nearly empty, yet landing with precision, not drifting, not crashing, not ditching, landing, controlled, alive. To Japanese flight crews, this looked like a contradiction to the laws of aerial endurance. They thought American planes simply carried more fuel. They did not. They thought America used secret fuel additives. They did not. They thought U.S. pilots were ignoring return limits and gambling with their lives. They were not. What Japan did not understand was the depth of American fuel discipline. U.S. pilots learned to lean their mixture gradually over hours of flight, squeezing endurance from every drop. They adjusted altitude to ride favorable air currents invisible to the naked eye. They used formation flying to reduce drag and save cooperative fuel. They tracked navigation with relentless calculation. Every minute accounted for. To Japanese pilots, these methods were unfamiliar, because Japanese aviation training prioritized aggression over longevity. Their pilots were taught to fight. For the men in the cockpit, fuel was not just a measurement. It was time. Time to strike. Time to return. Time to live. Every American pilot launching from a carrier deck knew a truth that could not be softened or ignored. Over the Pacific, running out of fuel meant death. There would be no fields to crash land in, no roads to glide onto, no barns or beaches to skid across. Below was only water. Endless, cold, irreversible. The ocean did not forgive miscalculation. It swallowed pilots whole. And yet, these men flew missions that pushed them to the very edge of endurance. In the cockpit, fuel gauges were small, round, and brutally honest. A pilot could glance down and see exactly how much life he had left. There was no pretending, no hoping the gauge was wrong. Every flick of the needle was a reminder. You have this many minutes left. Not hours, minutes. Now imagine returning from a strike deep in enemy territory. The adrenaline fading, the sky dimming, the horizon still empty. No carrier in sight. The engine vibrations becoming more noticeable, sounding thinner, weaker, and that gauge steadily sinking toward zero. This was the moment where training separated panic from precision. American pilots were taught to breathe slowly, to calculate distance in their head, to trim the aircraft for best glide ratio, to trust numbers more than fear. They were taught something else, too. You are not alone. American radio discipline, something Japan never matched, meant that even in the air, pilots flew as a unit. They shared fuel warnings. They warned of wind drift. They coordinated formations that could save distance, conserve energy, and keep weaker aircraft in the group. A pilot running low on fuel could call his flight lead, and instead of silence, he would hear a response. Calm, direct, focused. A voice that steadied hands and slowed heartbeats. This human support mattered. Fear did not disappear, but it did not control the cockpit. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots carried a different burden. Their culture demanded silence in hardship, unwavering stoicism, a refusal to show distress. A Japanese pilot low on fuel often faced it alone. No rescue destroyer searching the waves for him. No trained seaplane squadron launching on his behalf. No confidence that returning with an empty tank would be considered a success rather than a failure of planning. To ditch and die was honorable. To survive by caution was not celebrated. This difference shaped behavior thousands of feet above the ocean. For U.S. pilots, survival was not just personal. It was strategic. The war was long, and experience mattered. The Navy needed veterans in the air, not martyrs in the water. Every landing, especially the hardest ones, the ones with tanks nearly dry and engines barely holding, strengthened the entire force. Experienced pilots became instructors, flight leaders, squadron commanders. They passed on wisdom that could not be learned in manuals. A returning American pilot did not just save himself. He preserved knowledge. This was the true fuel of American dominance. Stories circulated on American carriers of pilots landing with only seconds of fuel remaining. Crews watched men step out of cockpits drenched in sweat, legs shaking, hands trembling from the strain of maintaining perfect throttle control for hour after hour. These pilots were not fearless. They were fearless despite fear. And that distinction is everything, because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is flying anyway. The Japanese saw these returns, and it changed how they viewed American aviators. They had expected recklessness and desperation, but what they saw instead was discipline under extreme pressure. Pilots who should have been panicked were calm. Aircraft that should have fallen were landing. Squadrons that should have scattered were returning together. This was not luck. This was mastery. And the moment this mastery revealed itself most clearly was during one of the most decisive carrier battles of the war. When long-range strike aircraft were pushed to their limits, when Japanese command believed the Americans had gone too far, when analysts marked fuel consumption as certain death, but the Americans came back. To understand how this moment shattered Japanese confidence, we must go to the battle that changed everything, the Philippine Sea. When Japanese pilots watched American aircraft return with almost no fuel remaining, they assumed something supernatural was at play. They believed no machine, no pilot, no training regimen could push range that far and still make it back alive. But the truth was far more grounded and far more formidable. The United States had engineered a system of aviation endurance that blended technology, tactics, and support infrastructure in a way Japan never fully understood. The first advantage was engine management. American carrier aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat, SBD Dauntless, and TBF Avenger were powered by rugged, fuel-efficient radial engines. These engines were designed to run at controlled mixture settings for long durations. U.S. pilots learned to adjust fuel-air mix in flight, not once, but continuously, to find the leanest burn possible without stalling the engine. This was a delicate balance. Too rich and fuel vanished too quickly. Too lean, and the engine coughed, sputtered, and risked failure over open ocean. Japanese pilots were trained to run engines for maximum performance in combat, not maximum endurance in transit. Their aircraft, including the famed A6M-0, were agile and deadly, but optimized for maneuverability, not fuel-stretching survival flights. In long-range return scenarios, endurance always favored the Americans, but engines alone were not enough. The second advantage was navigation precision. Japan relied heavily on individual pilot experience and visual judgment, the intuition of the warrior. The United States relied on numbers. American aviators carried standardized navigation boards that listed headings, wind compensation factors, estimated fuel burn per stage, and emergency return courses. Every mission had a designated return corridor. Every pilot could calculate drift, distance, and remaining time with pencil, map, and mental arithmetic, even while flying through turbulence or under anti-aircraft fire. And then there was the matter of communications. American radio discipline was a weapon in itself. Pilots spoke sparingly, clearly, and with preset phrases that communicated complex situations in seconds. A flight leader could reorder formations, alter return course, or calculate reserve priorities without disrupting focus. Japan struggled with consistent radio coordination. Many of their pilots even flew with radios turned off to reduce weight and avoid detection. The difference was not dramatic in small engagements, but during multi-hour missions over thousands of miles of ocean, it became decisive. Then came the carrier deck system. American aircraft carriers were not just ships. They were flying platforms with orchestrated precision. On return, low-fuel aircraft were given immediate landing priority. Deck crews cleared space, removed idle aircraft, and configured arresting wires in seconds. Everyone understood what it meant when a plane circled with sputtering engines. Lives depended on the crew being faster than fuel consumption. By contrast, Japanese carriers often required more time between recoveries. Their deck systems were not optimized for rapid cycling. If a Japanese aircraft returned critically low on fuel and had to wait its turn, the ocean claimed it. But perhaps the most underestimated American advantage was something Japan never committed to: search and rescue. Where Japanese pilots accepted the sea as a grave, the United States refused to. Destroyers, escort carriers, PT boats, submarines, and PBY Catalina seaplanes were all integrated into a coordinated rescue network. If a pilot went down, rescue units launched immediately. The system was not perfect, but it was present, and it changed how pilots flew. When a pilot knows he may be saved, he pushes farther. When he knows no one is coming, caution replaces risk. This shaped morale. This shaped aggression. This shaped endurance. Japan saw American aircraft returning with nearly empty tanks and believed it showed recklessness. But it showed confidence. Confidence backed by a war machine built to sustain effort over time. And nowhere did this system prove itself more powerfully than in the battle where Japan expected the Americans to fail at endurance, range, and operational discipline entirely. A battle where returning on fumes would decide the fate of fleets, the skies above the Philippine Sea. Where disbelief would turn into realization, and where Japanese pilots would watch, helpless, as American aircraft returned from flights that should have ended in the water. The Philippine Sea stretched out like an endless sheet of dark blue steel, calm on the surface, yet hiding the fate of empires beneath. In June 1944, the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy faced one another in what would become one of the largest carrier battles in history. The Americans called the operation to capture the Mariana Islands, a necessary step toward reaching Japan's home islands. The Japanese saw it as a last chance to halt the advance before it reached their doorstep. This confrontation was not accidental. It was inevitable. From the very start, Japan believed they held the strategic advantage in range. Their intelligence officers calculated the distances involved and concluded that American aircraft could not fly deep strike missions against their fleet and still return safely. They believed the distances were too great, the fuel margins too thin, the pilots too inexperienced. If the Americans tried to strike first, they would run out of fuel before making it back to their carriers. They were wrong. On June 19, 1944, American radar screens aboard Task Force 58 lit up with approaching Japanese air groups. The incoming wave was vast, but its organization was loose, its coordination strained. U.S. fighter direction officers, scanning through the glowing arcs of their radar displays, began vectoring dozens of F-6F Hellcats to intercept. The sky erupted into battle. The Americans tore through Japanese formations with disciplined ferocity. Pilots later described it not as a fight, but as a harvest. The Japanese aircraft, lighter and more agile, could still maneuver, but they lacked armor, radios, and experienced pilots who could adapt mid-engagement. The Japanese attack waves broke apart before reaching the American carriers. What survived turned back, damaged and disoriented. Meanwhile, the U.S. carriers prepared their own strike groups for launch. This was the moment Japan did not believe could happen. American planes flying out farther than the Japanese deemed survivable. Dozens of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters lifted from the pitching decks and disappeared into the horizon. Behind them, on the carrier decks, officers looked at the distances and the time estimates. They knew the strike was at the limit of fuel endurance. The pilots knew it too. There would be no quick return. Every pilot launching understood the math. If they missed their carriers on the way back, if the sea weather shifted, if wind direction changed, if battle damage increased drag, they would not make it home. They flew anyway. Hours later, they found the Japanese fleet. Bomb hits punched into carrier decks. Torpedo tracks carved through water. Smoke ripped into the sky. Japan suffered not just damage, but shock. Shock that the Americans had reached them at all. The return flight would be the true test. Fuel levels were already falling below comfort. Some pilots reported gauges so low that needles barely registered movement. Then came the most harrowing moment. The sun began to set. Returning to carriers in daylight with low fuel was already dangerous. Returning in darkness was nearly impossible, but the Americans kept formation. There was no panic. They did not fan out in desperation. They stayed in the sky together, trusting the discipline drilled into them, trusting that their carriers would guide them home. Aboard the U.S. fleet, every radio operator, every signal officer, every helmsman understood the urgency. Darkness consumed the ocean. The carriers lit their deck lights, knowing this risked submarine attack. It was a decision that balanced danger against loyalty. The fleet could be attacked, but their pilots were still out there, and they would not be abandoned. Japanese observers watching the return from distant positions could only imagine the chaos the Americans must be facing. They believed that no pilot could land with so little fuel. They expected to hear reports of dozens of planes ditching into the sea. That didn't happen. One after another, American aircraft appeared out of the darkness, silhouettes emerging against the soft glow of carrier deck lights, engines sputtering, canopies fogged, cockpits trembling with exhaustion. Some landed so close to stalling that their wheels touched the deck at the very moment their engines gasped for air. Some pilots had just enough fuel to taxi to the side. Others shut down immediately on landing, unable to move further. A few planes crashed on approach, but rescue teams were already on the deck before the metal even stopped moving. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. To them, fuel starvation was a death sentence. To the Americans, it was a margin they had learned to master. The difference was not bravery. Both sides were brave. The difference was discipline under pressure. American pilots did not simply hope they would make it home. They calculated it. They trained for it. They internalized every skill required to turn inches of fuel into miles of survival. And just as importantly, their fleet expected to save them. Destroyers patrolled the waters, searching for any pilot forced to ditch. Recovery ships were already moving before the first aircraft appeared on radar. Even submarines were repositioned to rescue downed airmen. Japanese command had not prepared for this possibility, and they could not. Their system was built for sacrifice, not recovery. On that night, above those dark waters, the Imperial Japanese Navy witnessed something they had never imagined. A force that could push past the limit and come back alive. Not because they were lucky, not because they were reckless, but because they had built the machinery of war to support life and return, not to trade men for moments of temporary glory. The return of those American aircraft signaled more than survival. It signaled a shift in the Pacific, a shift Japan could neither reverse nor outrun. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended, the ocean was quiet again. Wreckage drifted in long, slow patterns across the waves. Oil slicks shimmered under the sun. The Americans recovered their pilots, refueled their ships, and prepared for the next operation. The Japanese fleet, by contrast, returned home wounded, not just in numbers, but in belief. Something had broken. Before this battle, Japan believed range was their domain. Their commanders had taken pride in the idea that Japanese pilots could fly farther, endure more, and sacrifice themselves more willingly than any American. They thought the United States, with its factories and mass training programs, could build machines, but not aviators with spirit. The returns during the Philippine Sea shattered that illusion. Japanese analysts reviewed the battle data with disbelief. They measured the distances flown, the time airborne, the combat fuel consumption, the return times. They ran the numbers again and again, searching for a missing variable. But the truth, when they finally admitted it, was simple. The Americans had built a war machine that valued survival, training, and repeatable success. Their pilots did not simply fly. They lasted. The psychological blow was severe. Japanese pilots who survived the battle reported feeling something new, something they did not have a word for at first. It was not fear of the Americans. They had been fighting Americans for years. It was something more unsettling: respect. They saw men who flew to the edge of possibility and still came home. They saw skill, not luck. They saw calm, not desperation. And in that calm, they realized that the Americans were not simply strong. They were relentless. This was the real turning point. After the Philippine Sea, Japan no longer believed endurance was their advantage. They began shortening mission ranges. They withdrew carriers to safer distances. They launched fewer deep strikes. They protected flight crews more cautiously. Fear of losing irreplaceable pilots weighed on every decision. The war had shifted from bold offense to guarded survival. Meanwhile, the United States did the opposite. With each returning pilot, each recovered crewman, each veteran who lived to fly another day. The U.S. aviation ranks grew smarter, steadier, more coordinated. Experience was passed down like inheritance. Squadrons became tighter. Fuel discipline became second nature. Carrier operations became faster still. The Americans were not just winning battles, they were refining the system that won them. By early 1945, the difference between the two forces was undeniable. American carriers moved confidently across the Pacific, launching long strike missions that stretched farther than ever. Their pilots returned exhausted but alive. Their ships lit the night sky for them when necessary. Their rescue teams waited in the waves for any who fell short. And back home, factories continued to produce more aircraft, more engines, more fuel tanks, more replacement parts, more future strength. Japan could not match this. Not in industry, not in training, not in doctrine. Their ace pilots were gone. Their carriers were damaged or sunk. Their replacements were rushed through training programs that lacked the depth, patience, and structure of American aviation schools. Their aircraft grew lighter and more desperate, built for short-term offense rather than long-term survival. The war had become a matter of endurance, and endurance favored the nation that valued life, not sacrifice alone. When Japanese officers later wrote about the battle, some described the moment American aircraft returned with almost no fuel left as the breaking of the horizon. Not because the sight itself was dramatic. Many only saw distant silhouettes, landing on faintly lit decks. But because the meaning was inescapable, if the Americans could fly that far and still return, then there was nowhere Japan could hide. In the Pacific, distance had once been Japan's shield. Now it belonged to the United States. This realization did not end the war overnight, but it set its direction. From the Marianas to the Philippines, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa, the American advance continued. Steady, heavy, unstoppable. Japan still fought fiercely. Their bravery never dimmed, but the strategic balance had shifted forever. The story of the planes returning with almost empty fuel tanks is not just about aviation skill. It is about the values driving the war. The United States fought to preserve pilots, to build strength through survival. Japan fought to expend pilots, to win glory through sacrifice. One philosophy built momentum. The other bled itself dry, and the ocean remembers which one endured.